You've been told perfectionism is a problem. Too high standards, too hard on yourself, need to learn to let go. That's not wrong, exactly, but it's missing something. Perfectionism isn't a character flaw that snuck in uninvited. It's a strategy your brain designed on purpose, a very effective strategy actually. For avoiding the one thing you're most afraid of, the problem isn't that it doesn't work. The problem is what it costs you while it's working, and the cost is specific. It's not just stress or anxiety or the vague feeling that you're never quite satisfied. It's output, finished things. Work that actually exists in the world instead of living permanently in the folder on your desktop labeled draft that you haven't opened since March. Because here's what perfectionism actually produces in practice for most people who have it: not better work, less of it. That's the part nobody says out loud, and we need to talk about it. Stay with the word strategy for a second because I want to be precise about what I mean. A strategy isn't random. It doesn't happen by accident. A strategy exists because at some point it solved a problem. Something in your history made high standards feel like the safest move. Maybe it was a teacher who praised your best work and ignored the rest. Maybe it was a parent whose approval felt conditional on performance. Maybe it was the one time you handed something in before it was ready and it didn't land the way you hoped, and your brain filed that moment under never again. The brain is an extraordinary pattern detector. It notices what worked and it runs the pattern forward. You learned at some point that careful was safer than fast, that polished was safer than rough, that not finishing was safer than finishing badly. The strategy worked. The problem is that it's still running. In situations where the original threat no longer exists. In situations where the cost of not finishing is actually higher than the cost of finishing imperfectly, and your brain hasn't updated the file. It's still running a protection program designed for a version of you that needed protecting in a way you probably don't anymore. That's not a character flaw. That's a very loyal, very outdated piece of software. Now, there's a version of perfectionism that actually is about standards. Real standards. The surgeon who checks the procedure twice. The architect who runs the structural calculation again. There are domains where the cost of imperfection is genuinely high. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the version that shows up when the stakes are moderate or even low, and the standard still moves. The essay that's been revised 14 times and still doesn't feel ready, the business idea that's been researched for 6 months and still hasn't been tested. The creative project that lives entirely in your head because the version in your head is still better than anything you could actually make right now. The version in your head is always better than anything you could actually make right now. Of course it is. It's pure potential, untested, unbothered, perfect in the way that only imaginary things can be. The moment you start making it, it becomes real. And real things have edges, real things don't quite match the image, real things can be judged, and that's where the strategy kicks in. Because if you don't start, the perfect version stays intact, safe in the folder. Impossible to criticize, impossible to fail. You're not waiting for the work to be ready. You're protecting the idea from contact with reality. There's a name for the specific mechanism running underneath this. It's called self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is when you create conditions that give you an excuse for potential failure before the failure happens. The student who doesn't study so that a bad grade reflects lack of effort rather than lack of ability. The creative who never quite finishes so that the work can never quite be judged. The logic is quietly airtight. If I don't fully commit, I can't fully fail. Because full commitment followed by failure would tell me something I don't want to know. It would tell me that I tried my best and it still wasn't enough. Not trying keeps the possibility alive. The business could still work. The novel could still be good. The project could still land. Nothing has been disproved yet because nothing has been tested yet. Your brain is protecting your self-concept at the expense of your actual life, and it's doing it so smoothly under such a reasonable-sounding cover story that most people never notice the trade they're making. Here's how you can tell the difference between genuine quality standards and the strategy. Genuine quality standards have a finish line. You know what done looks like? You can describe the conditions under which you would consider this ready. The standard is demanding, but it's defined. The strategy has no finish line. The standard keeps moving. Every time you get close, something else needs adjusting. The intro needs rewriting. The research needs more depth. The design needs another pass. There's always one more thing, and the one more thing never ends, because the one more thing was never really about the work. Ask yourself this: if I were given a hard deadline, external, non-negotiable, and I had to hand this in tomorrow, would it be good enough? For most of the things people have been sitting on for months, the honest answer is yes. Not perfect, but good enough. The perfectionist doesn't lack the work. They lack permission to stop. And the permission has to come from somewhere, because the standard will not grant it. I want to introduce an image here because I think it explains what's actually happening better than any clinical definition. Imagine a sculptor with a block of marble. The sculptor has a very clear idea of what the finished piece looks like. Now here's the problem. The sculptor won't touch the marble because the moment the chisel makes contact, the block is no longer perfect potential. It's a work in progress. And a work in progress can be wrong. A chip in the wrong place can't be undone. What if the block cracks? What if the proportions are off? So the sculptor studies the block, reads about technique, makes sketches, thinks about the angle of the first cut, plans the sequence of steps, buys better tools, and the marble sits there, uncut, perfect in potential, useless in practice. The sculptor is not lazy. The sculptor is not unmotivated. The sculptor is terrified that the thing they make will be less than the thing they imagined. And the only way to guarantee that doesn't happen is to never make it. That is the trade. The imaginary perfect version protected at the cost of the real imperfect one that could have existed, could have been used, could have been seen. You don't know what's in the block until you start cutting. Now let's talk about the failure mode that catches the people who've already figured some of this out, because there's a more advanced version of the trap and it's harder to see from the inside. Some people hear everything I just said and they think, right, I need to lower my standards. Just ship it. Done is better than perfect is true for things that have been genuinely over-refined. The goal is never low standards. The goal is accurate standards. Standards that are calibrated to the actual stakes of the situation rather than to the maximum possible anxiety the situation can generate. Because perfectionism doesn't apply its standards evenly. We'll spend 6 hours perfecting the thing that matters and 6 hours perfecting the thing that doesn't. Perfectionism is not a quality control system. It is an anxiety management system wearing quality control's clothes. The standards aren't calibrated to the work. They're calibrated to the fear, which means the fix isn't to stop caring about quality. The fix is to stop letting the anxiety set the standard. There's a concept in manufacturing called good enough engineering. It sounds dismissive. It isn't. Good enough engineering means building to the specification that the situation actually requires. Not underbuilding, not cutting corners on the load-bearing elements, but not over-engineering components that don't need it either. A bridge needs to hold 10 times its expected load. The screws holding the bridge's informational sign together do not. Same project. Completely different standards. Both appropriate. The perfectionist builds everything to bridge standard, including the screws for the sign. The exhaustion is real. The slow output is real. And neither of them is because of high standards. They're because of misapplied standards. Standards that haven't been sorted by what actually matters. The question to ask for every element of every project is not, could this be better? It can always be better. The question is, does making it better change the outcome in a way that matters? If yes, keep going. If no, you're done. Move. Let's build the practical system. Because a diagnosis without a path forward is just an interesting way to feel bad about yourself. And that's not what we're here for. 5 tools, use them in order when you feel the perfectionism strategy kicking in. First, name what you're protecting. When you notice yourself not starting, not finishing, endlessly revising something that's been endlessly revised, ask a specific question. What outcome am I actually afraid of? Not in the abstract. Specifically, if I publish this and it fails, what exactly happens? If I launch this and it's bad, what exactly is the consequence? Write it down. Get it out of the abstract and into the concrete. Most of the time, when you actually write out the feared outcome, it loses a significant amount of its power. The brain's threat detection system is much better at generating fear than at assessing it. Getting the fear into words forces an assessment, and assessments are things you can work with. Second, define done before you start. Before you begin any piece of work, write down in one sentence what done looks like. Not perfect, done. What is the minimum version of this that would be genuinely useful or genuinely complete? This matters because the perfectionism strategy gets most of its power from the absence of a finish line. When there's no defined endpoint, the standard expands to fill all available space. When there's a defined endpoint, the standard has somewhere to stop. Done is not the same as good enough. Done means what you said done meant when you started. Hold to that definition when the anxiety starts lobbying for revisions. Third, separate the drafting from the judging. This is a structural fix, not a mindset fix, which is why it actually works. Most perfectionism doesn't happen when the work is finished. It happens mid-creation, when the judging starts before the drafting is complete. You write a sentence and immediately evaluate it. You build something and immediately critique it. The internal editor arrives before the work exists, and it tries to hold the work to a finished standard while it's still raw material. The fix is a protocol while creating no judging. Not suppressing the judgment, just deferring it. Write the whole draft, build the whole thing, record the whole session, then go back and edit. 2 separate modes, 2 separate sessions if possible. The judging is not the enemy. The timing is the enemy. Fourth, use the 80% launch rule. When you feel like the work is about 80% of where you want it to be, ask whether it's ready for the world, not whether it's perfect. 80% is almost always functional. 80% is almost always better than most of what's out there. And the feedback you get from putting 80% into the world will tell you more about what the remaining 20% should actually be than another 6 months of internal revision ever could. The world is a better editor than your anxiety, but only if you let it see the work. Fifth, shrink the first move. The perfectionism strategy is most powerful at the start. The blank page, the empty canvas, the first line of code, the first sentence of the email. That's where the standard feels most crushing, because there's nothing there yet, and everything is possible and everything is also potentially wrong. The fix is to make the first move so small it can't be judged. Not write the introduction, write 1 sentence. Not record the video, record the first 30 seconds. Not build the feature, write the function signature. Something so small that even your perfectionism can't find anything to object to. Once something exists, continuing is easier than starting. The standard relaxes slightly when there's already work on the page. It's harder to demand perfection from something that's already in motion than from something that hasn't started yet. 1 sentence, 1 paragraph, 1 rough version. Put something there. The strategy loses power the moment anything exists. There's something underneath all of this that I want to name before we close. Perfectionism gets treated as a productivity problem, a finishing problem, a shipping problem. And those symptoms are real. But the root isn't about productivity, it's about identity. The perfectionist's deepest fear isn't that the work will be bad. It's that if the work is bad, that says something about them. The work is a proxy for the self. A bad project doesn't mean a bad project. It means I'm not as capable as I thought. I'm not as talented as I hoped. The thing I built says something about what I am, and what I am might not be enough. That's the real structure of the fear. And that's why the strategy is so persistent, because the stakes feel enormous. Not project scale enormous, identity scale enormous. The renovation is this: separating the work from the self, not in a detached, nothing matters way, but in the accurate way. The work is a thing you made. It reflects your current skill level, your current knowledge, your current resources and constraints. It does not reflect your worth. It does not reflect your ceiling. It tells you what you made today. It exists. That matters more than you think. Here's the whole system one more time. Perfectionism is a strategy, not a flaw. It protects the self-concept by preventing the work from being tested. The cost is output. Finish things, the version of your work that actually exists in the world. The fix is not lower standards. The fix is accurate standards applied proportionally to what actually matters. Name what you're protecting. Define done before you start. Separate the drafting from the judging. Use the 80% launch rule. Shrink the first move until it's too small to refuse. The perfect version in your head will always be better than anything you make. That will never change. The question is whether you're willing to make the real one anyway. Start imperfectly. The marble doesn't care about your hesitation. It's just waiting for the chisel. And hey, if this landed, subscribe. Hit the like button. Let me know in the comments.